In the shadow of the great battles of World War II lies a tragedy that was silenced for decades. The Battle of Rzhev, a bloody confrontation that lasted from January 42nd to March 43rd. 14 months of continuous fighting, hundreds of thousands of fallen Soviet soldiers, and all of it practically erased from the official history of the war for many years. Why did one of the largest battles fall into oblivion? The Rzhev salient, deeply wedged into Soviet territory, posed a mortal threat to Moscow. The German Army Group's center created a powerful defensive line here. The Soviet command repeatedly threw troops into the assault on this stronghold, trying to eliminate the dangerous salient. Offensives followed one after another, in winter, spring, summer, autumn of '42. Each operation ended with enormous losses and minimal territorial gains. In official Soviet historiography, these events long remained merely a brief episode, lost between the heroic defense of Moscow and the triumphant victory at Stalingrad. By the beginning of 1942, the strategic situation on the Soviet-German front had undergone radical changes. The Red Army's counteroffensive near Moscow inflicted the first serious defeat on the Wehrmacht. German troops, who had recently stood a few tens of kilometers from the Soviet capital, were pushed back by 100 to 200 kilometers. However, the Blitzkrieg did not completely fail. The enemy held vast territories and maintained the initiative in many sectors of the front. Particularly dangerous remained the Rzhev salient, a wedge of German positions deeply embedded in the Soviet defenses. This salient, resembling a massive fist, hung over Moscow from the west. Here, the main forces of Army Group Center, the most combat-ready German formation on the Eastern Front, were concentrated. The Soviet High Command understood. As long as this salient existed, Moscow was under constant threat of a new offensive. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command developed an ambitious plan to cut off the salient, encircle and destroy a large enemy grouping. This task was entrusted to the Kalinin Front under the command of General Konev, and the Western Front under the leadership of General Zhukov. The German command also recognized the strategic importance of the Rzhev salient. Hitler declared this area the cornerstone of the Eastern Front and ordered it to be held at all costs. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Germans transformed Rzhev and the surrounding territories into a true fortress. A deeply echeloned defense was created with bunkers, pillboxes, minefields, and barbed wire entanglements. Moreover, the geographical conditions were ideally suited for defense. Hilly terrain, numerous rivers and streams, swamps and forests. All this hampered offensive operations. The Germans skillfully used the features of the landscape, placing firing points on dominant heights and turning villages into strongholds. An important factor was also the state of the Soviet troops by the beginning of 1942. Despite the success of the counteroffensive near Moscow, the Red Army was exhausted. There was a shortage of experienced commanders, equipment, and ammunition. Many divisions were only 50 to 60% complete. Nevertheless, Stalin demanded a continuation of the offensive along the entire front. Under these circumstances, the first Rzhev operation began. The Soviet command planned to break through the German defenses with the forces of several armies, encircle the main enemy forces, and liberate important transport hubs: Rzhev, Vyazma, Sychovka. However, from the very first days of the offensive, it became clear that the operation was not developing according to plan. On January 8, 1942, Soviet troops launched an offensive. The first Rzhev operation began, a large-scale battle that would last almost 4 months and claim tens of thousands of lives. The operation's plan looked promising. Using the forces of the Kalinin and Western fronts to encircle and destroy the main forces of Army Group Center, in the Rzhev, Vyazma, and Yukhnov areas. However, reality proved to be far harsher than the Stavka had anticipated. Frosts reached 30 degrees below zero, and the snow cover exceeded half a meter. Equipment bogged down, soldiers suffered from frostbite, and supplies barely kept pace with the advancing units. But the main problem lay elsewhere. The enemy turned out to be much stronger than intelligence had suggested. The Germans had created a powerful defensive system, saturated with firing points and minefields. Every village was turned into a fortified strongpoint, every height into an impregnable fortress. Nevertheless, in the first days of the offensive, Soviet troops achieved some success. General Sokolov's 11th Cavalry Corps broke through into the enemy's rear and rushed towards Vyazma. General Maslenikov's 39th Army also managed to breach the German defenses. It seemed the encirclement plan was beginning to work. But the German command quickly assessed the threat and took decisive action. Field Marshal Kluge transferred reserves, closing the most dangerous sectors. Simultaneously, the weather sharply deteriorated. A thaw was replaced by new frosts, further complicating the actions of the Soviet troops. By the end of January, it became evident that the initial plan of the operation was failing. The advancing units were stretched thin, flanks were exposed, and coordination between armies was disrupted. A particularly difficult situation developed with the 39th Army and the 11th Cavalry Corps, which found themselves semi-encircled. The Germans counterattacked, cutting off Soviet units from the main forces. The second phase of the operation began, a struggle for the survival of the breakthrough formations. Zhukov and Konev tried to relieve the encircled troops, but without success. German forces methodically tightened the ring. By mid-February 1942, the 11th Cavalry Corps had practically ceased to exist. The remnants of the 39th Army fought their way out of the encirclement. Only a few managed to escape the deadly cauldron. In March-April, the fighting took on a positional character. Soviet troops undertook local attacks, trying to improve their position. But every meter of ground came at the cost of dozens of lives. The Germans responded with counterattacks, preventing the enemy from consolidating their gains. By April 20th, the first Rzhev-Vyazma operation officially ended. Its results were disappointing. With minor territorial gains, losses amounted to about 270,000 people. The main goal, the encirclement and destruction of the Rzhev-Vyazma enemy grouping, was not achieved. The reasons for the failure lay in several factors. Firstly, the operation was prepared in haste, without proper reconnaissance and material support. Secondly, the Soviet command overestimated the capabilities of its troops and underestimated the strength of the enemy. Thirdly, the lack of experience in conducting large offensive operations played a role. Nevertheless, the first Rzhev-Vyazma operation also had positive significance. It prevented the German command from transferring reserves to the southern direction, where equally dramatic events were unfolding at the time. Moreover, Soviet troops gained invaluable, albeit dearly paid for with immense blood, experience in breaking through fortified enemy defenses. By May 1942, after the failure of the first Rzhev-Vyazma operation, the situation on the central sector of the front remained extremely tense. Soviet troops, having suffered enormous losses, held bridgeheads in the enemy's rear, but were in an extremely vulnerable position. The German command could not tolerate this situation and developed a plan for a counterattack, codenamed Seydlitz. The operation was named after an 18th-century Prussian cavalry general, famous for his daring maneuvers. The choice of name was symbolic. The Germans planned to demonstrate the mastery of maneuver warfare that had brought them success at the beginning of the campaign against the USSR. The main objective of Operation Seydlitz was General Maslenikov's 39th Army, which had deeply penetrated the German defenses but found itself semi-encircled. Field Marshal Model whom Hitler had appointed commander of the Ninth Army specifically for his ability to organize defense, personally directed the preparation of the attack. The Germans prepared meticulously. Tank and motorized units, including the elite Grossdeutschland division, were transferred to the concentration area. The Luftwaffe aviation was ordered to ensure complete air superiority. Intelligence scrupulously identified weak points in the Soviet troop dispositions. On May 21, 1942, German troops launched a powerful attack on the base of the salient where the 39th Army was located. Simultaneously, General Belov's group, operating in the German rear, was attacked. The enemy used a pincers tactic. Two powerful strikes from the north and south, aimed at linking up and encircling the Soviet troops. German tank wedges rapidly advanced, overcoming the resistance of the bled-out Soviet units. Aviation continuously bombed positions, communication nodes, and supply routes. 3 days later, advanced German units linked up in the Nestorovo area, closing the encirclement ring around the main forces of the 39th Army. The Soviet command tried to organize a relief strike from the outside, but the available forces were insufficient. The encircled troops received orders to break through independently. Desperate attempts to escape the cauldron began. Groups of soldiers, often without heavy weaponry, made their way through forests and swamps, trying to reach their own lines. The Germans methodically tightened the ring, breaking the encircled grouping into separate pockets of resistance. Special mobile detachments, equipped with armored vehicles and supported by aviation, were actively used to combat the breakthrough groups. By the end of May, Operation Seydlitz was completed. The 39th Army ceased to exist as an organized fighting unit. Only individual groups managed to break through to their own lines. Most of the soldiers and officers died or were captured. A similar fate befell Belov's group, although it managed to retain more personnel. The success of Operation Seydlitz demonstrated the strengths of German tactics. The skillful use of mobile reserves, clear interaction between branches of service, and flexibility in command. The Germans still surpassed the Red Army in maneuver warfare, especially in organizing counterattacks. By the summer of 1942, Soviet command had not abandoned attempts to eliminate the dangerous Rzhev salient. After the failure of the first Rzhev Vyazma operation and the defeat of part of the Soviet forces during the German Operation Seydlitz, a new offensive was required. Thus was born the operation, codenamed Seismograph, a large-scale summer offensive designed to shake German defenses like an earthquake. Preparations for the operation began in June. The Stavka VGK entrusted its execution to the troops of the Kalinin Front, under the command of General Konev. The main blow was delivered by the 30th Army of General Lelyushenko, reinforced by tank and artillery units. The operations plan envisioned breaking through German defenses in the sector of Pogorelloy Gorodishche, Zubtsov, followed by the development of the offensive on Rzhev. Unlike the winter-spring battles, the summer campaign created different tactical conditions. Dry weather favored the use of tanks and aviation, but simultaneously hindered camouflage. The Germans could easily detect the movements of Soviet troops and deliver preemptive strikes. Additionally, over the preceding months, the enemy had significantly strengthened its defenses, creating new engineering structures and minefields. On July 30, 1942, the operation began with a powerful artillery barrage. Hundreds of guns unleashed thousands of shells on German positions. Following the fiery wave, infantry advanced, supported by tanks. On the first day of the offensive, Soviet troops managed to penetrate German defenses to a depth of up to 3 kilometers. However, already on the second day, the pace of the offensive sharply decreased. German command quickly redeployed reserves and organized counterattacks. Particularly fierce battles unfolded for Height 245 and the village of Polunino. These key points changed hands several times a day. Every meter of land was drenched in the blood of both sides. Breaking through the German defenses to their full depth proved impossible. The enemy skillfully used a system of strongpoints and pre-prepared firing positions. As soon as Soviet units broke through the first line of defense, they came under crossfire from bunkers and pillboxes of the second line. Luftwaffe aviation delivered continuous strikes against the advancing troops. Despite heavy losses, Konev demanded the continuation of the offensive. More and more units were brought into battle. By August 10, Soviet troops managed to advance several more kilometers, liberating a number of settlements. However, the cost of this advance proved exorbitantly high. Tens of thousands killed and wounded. By August 20th, Operation Seismograph had effectively run out of steam. The offensive momentum of Soviet troops was extinguished by stubborn enemy resistance and growing losses. The Stavka VGK decided to switch to defense and begin preparations for a new, larger-scale operation. The results of the summer offensive were contradictory. On one hand, Soviet troops managed to somewhat improve their positions, liberating about 10 settlements. On the other hand, the main goal, the elimination of the Rzhev salient, was not achieved. At the same time, losses amounted to about 60,000 people. Positional warfare near Rzhev was not just a clash of armies and equipment. It was a daily struggle for survival in inhumane conditions. Soldiers' everyday life here turned into a real ordeal, which cost many their lives, even without enemy bullets and shells. The winter of 41 to 42 was particularly severe. Frosts reached 35 degrees below zero. In such conditions, trench life became a real hell. Dugouts, hastily dug in the frozen ground, barely protected from the cold. Soldiers slept without taking off their greatcoats, huddled together to keep warm. Many fell asleep forever. Frost-bitten limbs, hypothermia claimed lives no less than German bullets. "We warmed ourselves as best we could," recalled Sergeant Ivan Nikolaev, a participant in the battles near Rzhev. "We burned everything that would burn. Sometimes we lit fires right in the trenches, risking giving away our positions. The choice was simple, either freeze for sure or risk coming under fire." With the arrival of spring, one misfortune was replaced by another. Thaw waters turned trenches and dugouts into mud traps. Water stood knee-deep, sometimes even higher. Soldiers went for weeks without taking off their wet shoes, which led to mass cases of trench foot, a painful condition in which the tissues of the feet began to die. Summer brought new challenges: heat, insects, and epidemics. Poor sanitation, lack of regular water supply, and inability to wash for weeks led to outbreaks of dysentery and typhus. Medical support left much to be desired. Field hospitals were overflowing with wounded. There was a shortage of medicines and bandages. "After being wounded, I ended up in a medical battalion," said Lieutenant Pyotr Smirnov. "There were so many wounded that we were laid directly on the ground, covered with straw. Operations were performed around the clock, often without anesthesia. The screams were so loud that the Germans probably heard them for several kilometers." A particular problem was food supply. During periods of active combat, delivering food to the front line became almost impossible. The soldiers' ration was reduced to a minimum: 100 to 200 grams of bread a day, sometimes a little porridge or rusks. Many fighters suffered from dystrophy, losing strength to fight. In such conditions, simple human joys acquired great importance: a letter from home, an extra cigarette, a gulp of alcohol before an attack. Frontline friendship became a real salvation. Soldiers shared their last piece of bread, covered each other in battle, and dragged wounded comrades from no man's land. All these factors inevitably affected the morale of the troops. By the summer of 42, many units involved in the Battle of Rzhev were bled dry, not only by combat losses, but also by disease and exhaustion. Reinforcements often consisted of green recruits who died in the first days. But even in these inhumane conditions, Soviet soldiers continued to fight. They found the strength not only to survive, but also to strike at the enemy. Their resilience and courage became the foundation on which the victories of the Red Army would later be built. In the autumn of 1942, the Soviet command was preparing two large-scale offensive operations. The first, codenamed Uranus, was planned near Stalingrad and subsequently went down in history as a triumph of Soviet military art. The second, named Mars, was finally supposed to eliminate the Rzhev salient. Both operations were developed simultaneously and were considered equally important. Stalin entrusted the leadership of Operation Mars to his most talented commander, Georgy Zhukov. The Western and Kalinin fronts received significant reinforcements: fresh rifle divisions, tank corps, artillery regiments. By November 1942, Soviet troops outnumbered the enemy in manpower by 2 times, in artillery by 3 times, and in tanks by almost 4 times. It seemed that such superiority guaranteed success. However, the German command, anticipating a new offensive, was also preparing for defense. Field Marshal Model, nicknamed the Führer's Fireman for his ability to stabilize critical sections of the front, personally supervised the strengthening of the defenses. A system of 5 defensive lines, with a depth of up to 20 kilometers, was created. Every village was turned into a fortified point with concrete firing positions and minefields. On November 25, 1942, Operation Mars began. After a powerful artillery barrage, Soviet troops went on the offensive. In the first days, some successes were achieved. The first lines of defense were broken through, several settlements were liberated. However, the offensive soon stalled. The Germans, using pre-prepared positions, offered fierce resistance. The weather also played into the hands of the defenders. A sudden thaw turned the roads into an impassable mess, hindering the movement of equipment and the supply of ammunition. Zhukov demanded the continuation of the offensive at any cost. The last reserves were thrown into battle. Tank units rushed to storm fortified positions without proper infantry support. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of tanks were destroyed. Thousands of soldiers died trying to carry out the order. By mid-December, it became obvious that the operation had failed. Soviet troops not only failed to eliminate the Rzhev salient, but also suffered enormous losses. About 300,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Losses in tank units were particularly heavy. More than 1,800 tanks were lost. Why did Operation Mars end in failure, while Uranus was crowned with a brilliant victory? Historians identify several key reasons. First, underestimation of the enemy. The German Army Group Center consisted of experienced, well-equipped units, unlike the stretched and weakened flanks near Stalingrad. Second, the difficulty of the terrain, which significantly limited maneuver and hampered the use of tank masses. Third, insufficient coordination between various armies and fronts. Finally, the element of surprise played a role. If the Soviet command managed to conceal its true intentions near Stalingrad, then in the Rzhev area, the Germans knew in advance about the impending offensive and thoroughly prepared for it. The German defensive system near Rzhev was a true masterpiece of military engineering. The Wehrmacht, drawing on extensive experience from the First World War and the early years of the Eastern Campaign, created here an almost impregnable fortress. The defense system was built on the principle of deeply echeloned lines, each of which could operate autonomously even if the previous one was breached. The foundation of the German defense consisted of strong points, fortified settlements transformed into true bastions. Every village became a node of resistance with all-round defense. Houses were turned into pillboxes, basements into shelters, and ammunition depots. Minefields, multi-row wire entanglements, and anti-tank ditches were created along the perimeter. Between the strong points were intermediate positions. a system of full-profile trenches with communication passages, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. The trenches had a zigzag shape, which prevented them from being swept by fire over a long stretch, and minimized losses from artillery fire and aerial bombs. The Germans paid special attention to utilizing the terrain. All dominant heights were turned into fortified positions. From these, all approaches to the defensive lines were visible and could be swept by fire. Machine gun positions were located in such a way as to create crossfire, leaving no dead zones. Rivers and streams, which abounded in the area, became natural anti-tank obstacles. The Germans fortified banks, mined fords, and approaches to bridges. Swamps were also included in the defense system. They channeled the advance of Soviet troops into pre-registered corridors. An important feature of the German defense was its multi-layered nature. The depth of the defensive positions reached 15 to 20 kilometers. Behind the first line of trenches was a second, and behind that, a third. Breaking through one line, Soviet troops immediately came under flanking fire from adjacent sectors and encountered a new line of defense. To combat tanks, the Germans created a system of anti-tank zones. Anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, and mines were concentrated in these zones. These areas were located in tank-dangerous directions and had all-round defense. Artillery was placed in concealed positions, well disguised and protected from air raids. Engineering obstacles played a special role. Minefields were laid in several strips. Both anti-personnel and anti-tank mines were used. Booby traps, designed for sappers attempting to clear passages, were often employed. Wire entanglements were set up in 3 to 4 rows, often with tripwire mines between them. The German defense system provided for active maneuvering of reserves. Mobile groups were located behind the front line, ready for immediate deployment to threatened sectors. An extensive road network allowed for rapid transfer of reinforcements. This explained the Germans' ability to quickly eliminate local breakthroughs by Soviet troops. The statistics of the Rzhev Battle are striking in their tragic nature. The total losses of Soviet troops over 14 months of fighting amounted, according to various estimates, to between 1,100,000 and 1,400,000 people. This is comparable to the losses in the Battle of Stalingrad, but unlike the victory on the Volga, no decisive turning point was achieved at Rzhev. The ratio of losses was also disheartening. For every German soldier killed, there were 5 to 6 Soviet soldiers. What lay behind this terrible disproportion? An analysis of documents reveals several key factors that led to such heavy losses. First and foremost, it was the nature of the terrain. The wooded, swampy territory with numerous rivers and streams was ideal for defense and extremely difficult for offensive operations. Tanks got stuck in swamps. Artillery struggled to move along muddy roads. The infantry had to attack well-fortified positions almost without cover. The second factor was the quality of command at the tactical level. By 1942, there was an acute shortage of experienced mid-level officers in the Red Army. Pre-war cadres had largely been lost in the catastrophic battles of 1941. Their places were taken by commanders who had undergone accelerated training and lacked sufficient experience in managing troops in difficult conditions. This led to tactical errors, an inability to maneuver on the battlefield, and an inability to effectively interact with artillery and tanks. The third reason was the specifics of the German defense. The enemy had created a deeply echeloned system of fortifications, saturated with firing points, minefields, and engineering obstacles. German units skillfully used the terrain, positioning their firepower on dominant heights. Every village was turned into a strong point with all-round defense. Breaking through such a defense required not only numerical superiority, but also high skill. The fourth factor was pressure from the Stavka VGK, General Headquarters. Stalin demanded results at any cost. Zhukov and Konev, in turn, rigidly demanded that their subordinates fulfill orders. As a result, commanders often threw troops into frontal assaults on fortified positions without sufficient artillery and air support. Losses were particularly high in Operation Mars, the last attempt by the Soviet command to eliminate the Rzhev salient in November-December 1942. In 3 weeks of fighting, the Red Army lost about 300,000 people, almost a third of all troops involved in the offensive. At the same time, territorial gains were minimal. Analyzing the structure of losses, historians note a disproportionately high share of irretrievable losses, killed and missing in action. This is explained not only by the ferocity of the fighting, but also by problems with the evacuation of the wounded. The medical service could not cope with the flow of casualties. Many died from wounds without receiving qualified assistance. Difficult weather conditions also increased mortality. In winter, many wounded froze to death in no man's land. And in summer, infections rapidly developed. What impact did the experience of the Rzhev Battle have on the further strategy of the war? After the failure of Operation Mars, the Soviet command revised its approaches to conducting offensive operations. It became obvious that frontal attacks on fortified defenses led to unacceptably high losses. In subsequent operations of 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, during the forcing of the Dnieper, much more attention was paid to reconnaissance, artillery preparation, and the interaction of different branches of service. The Rzhev Battle became a kind of school, albeit an extremely brutal one, where the Red Army learned to fight against an experienced and skillful enemy. The lessons, paid for with hundreds of thousands of lives, were not in vain. By early March 1943, the strategic situation on the Soviet-German front had radically changed. The triumphant victory at Stalingrad, the successful offensive in the southern direction, the liberation of a significant part of the occupied territories, all this created favorable conditions for the further development of the Soviet offensive. Against this background, the Rzhev salient, which had been a stumbling block for the Red Army for over a year, suddenly lost its strategic significance for the German command. The Hitlerite leadership, realizing the impossibility of holding the entire front line with a shortage of reserves, decided to voluntarily withdraw from the Rzhev Vyazma salient. The operation was codenamed Buffel, Buffalo. Its development was carried out by the Stab, headquarters, of Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. The operation plan envisioned a phased withdrawal of troops to pre-prepared positions along the Dukovshchina, Spasdemensk, Kirov line, which was named the Panther Line. This maneuver allowed shortening the front line by almost 200 kilometers and freeing up to 15 divisions, which could be used in other directions or as a reserve. The German command meticulously prepared for the withdrawal. Roads were laid, bridges were built across rivers, and intermediate defensive lines were created. Special attention was paid to camouflage. The enemy did everything possible to prevent Soviet intelligence from detecting signs of preparation for retreat. Simultaneously, a scorched earth operation was carried out. Everything that could be useful for Soviet troops was subject to destruction. Villages were burned, wells were poisoned, roads and bridges were mined. The local population was driven west or exterminated. In fact, the Germans turned the territory of the Rzhev salient into a lifeless desert. On March 2, 1943, Operation Buffel began. Rear units and heavy equipment were the first to withdraw. Combat outposts remained in position, creating the appearance of a full-fledged defense. The Soviet command, despite intelligence reports of strange activity in the enemy's rear, did not immediately recognize the beginning of the withdrawal. Only by March 5, when advanced units of the Kalinin and Western fronts discovered abandoned German positions, did it become clear that the enemy was retreating. Pursuit immediately began, but it was complicated by many factors: minefields, destroyed roads, rearguard battles. All this slowed the advance of Soviet troops. The Germans retreated in an organized manner, according to a prearranged plan. Rearguard units conducted delaying actions, allowing the main forces to withdraw to new lines. The withdrawal was covered by massive air and artillery strikes. Despite all the efforts of the Soviet command, it was not possible to encircle and destroy the retreating enemy. By March 20th, Operation Buffel was completed. German troops entrenched themselves on the Panther Line, shortening the front and freeing up significant forces. Soviet troops liberated Rzhev, Vyazma, Gzhatsk, and hundreds of other settlements. But the price of this success was destroyed cities and villages, scorched earth, and mined territories. Operation Buffel clearly demonstrated the changed nature of the war. If previously the German command clung to every meter of captured territory, now it had switched to a strategy of flexible defense, sacrificing space to preserve manpower and equipment. The Rzhev Battle was not only a clash of armies and strategies, but also a confrontation of personalities. The key figures in this drama were Army General Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the Western Front, and Colonel General Ivan Konev, who led the Kalinin Front. Their decisions, characters, and command methods largely determined the course and outcome of the bloody battles near Rzhev. Zhukov arrived at the Western Front in August 1942, replacing General Eremenko. By this time, he had already earned a reputation as a tough, demanding commander, capable of achieving results at any cost. After the successful defense of Moscow, Stalin saw in him a man capable of turning the tide on any section of the front. Zhukov was like a hammer, one of the Western Front's staff officers later recalled. He didn't know the word impossible. If he set a task, it had to be accomplished regardless of the circumstances. Failure to execute an order was tantamount to betrayal for him. Ivan Konev, commander of the Kalinin Front, represented a different type of military leader. More restrained, prone to meticulous analysis, he tried to minimize losses, although in the context of the heaviest fighting near Rzhev, this was not always successful. There was an unspoken rivalry between the two commanders, which sometimes escalated into open conflicts. Archival documents and memoirs of participants allow us to reconstruct the decision-making process during the Rzhev operations. Particularly illustrative is the preparation of Operation Mars, the last major attempt to eliminate the Rzhev salient in November-December 1942. Zhukov, appointed to coordinate the actions of the two fronts, was full of optimism. At a Stavka meeting, he confidently declared that with proper material support, the operation would be successfully completed in 7 to 10 days. Konev expressed more cautious assessments, pointing to strong German defenses and the difficult terrain. The commander's relationship with Stavka also influenced decision-making. Stalin demanded results and exerted constant pressure. In his memoirs, Zhukov later wrote, "The Supreme Commander did not accept any explanations about difficulties. He believed that we simply did not know how to fight." This pressure was transmitted down the chain of command. Army commanders demanded from corps commanders, and they from division commanders. As a result, troops were often thrown into attacks without proper preparation, leading to unjustifiably high losses. A telling episode occurred during Operation Mars, when General Kirillov, commander of the 20th Army, reported to Zhukov about the impossibility of continuing the offensive due to heavy losses. Zhukov immediately removed him from command and appointed General Voskanov in his place, ordering the attacks to resume. The result was predictable: thousands more killed with minimal advancement. It is interesting that in his post-war memoirs, Zhukov practically does not mention the Rzhev Battle, especially the failure of Operation Mars. Konev also very sparingly covers these events. Evidently, both marshals preferred not to dwell on this tragic page of the war. For many years after the end of the Great Patriotic War, the Rzhev Battle remained in the shadow of more famous battles. In official Soviet historiography, this bloody epic was only mentioned in passing, as an insignificant episode between the heroic defense of Moscow and the triumphant victory at Stalingrad. Why then did one of the largest and most tragic battles of the war become practically forgotten? The first post-war decades were characterized by a selective approach to military history. In the memoirs of military leaders, textbooks, and official publications, the emphasis was placed on victories, while failures were either hushed up or presented as tactical maneuvers. Zhukov, in his memoirs, Reminiscences and Reflections, devoted only a few paragraphs to the Rzhev Battle, although he led major operations there. Konev, in his memoirs, Notes of a Front Commander, also preferred not to delve into the details of the Rzhev tragedy. The official reason for the silence was simple: an unwillingness to tarnish the picture of a great victory with stories of tactical miscalculations and enormous losses. However, there were deeper reasons. The Rzhev Battle raised uncomfortable questions about the price of victory, the effectiveness of command, and the advisability of frontal assaults on fortified enemy positions. The first breach in the Wall of Silence was Alexander Tvardovsky's poem, "I Was Killed Near Rzhev," written in 1946. The piercing lines from the perspective of a fallen soldier became a true requiem for the victims of the Rzhev meat grinder. However, even this work could not fully reveal the scale of the tragedy. In the 60s and 70s, the first studies touching upon the Rzhev Battle appeared, but they were fragmented and did not provide a complete picture of events. Historians worked with limited access to archives. Many documents remained classified. A real turning point occurred only in the 80s with the beginning of the policy of glasnost. Memoirs of battle participants were published, and some archival materials were opened. Works truthfully reflecting the tragedy of Rzhev appeared in literature and cinema. Konstantin Simonov, in his novel Soldiers Are Not Born, was one of the first to show the true face of the war on the Rzhev salient. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the process of re-evaluating the Rzhev Battle accelerated. Historians gained access to previously closed archives, and it became possible to compare Soviet and German documents. Fundamental studies revealing the true scale of the battles and losses were published. In the 2000s, the memory of the Rzhev Battle began to return to public consciousness. The search movement played an important role in this. Thousands of volunteers annually recover the remains of fallen soldiers in the forests and swamps near Rzhev. Each such expedition is a living testament to the scale of the tragedy. The culmination of the return of historical memory was the opening in 2020 of the memorial to the Soviet soldier in the Rzhev area. The 25-meter bronze figure of a warrior, as if dissolving into the sky with a flock of cranes, became a symbol of memory for the hundreds of thousands who fell in these places. The Rzhev Battle became a harsh yet necessary school for Soviet military art. 14 months of bloody battles, hundreds of thousands of fallen soldiers, 4 large-scale offensive operations. All of this could not pass without a trace for military thought. What lessons did the Soviet command learn from the tragic experience of the Rzhev meat grinder? The first, and perhaps most important lesson, was the realization of the need for thorough preparation of offensive operations. If in 42 offensive operations often began without sufficient reconnaissance, artillery support, and material provision, then after Rzhev this approach fundamentally changed. The Battle of Kursk, the forcing of the Dnieper, Operation Bagration, all these successful operations of 43rd to 44th years were characterized by meticulous preparation, accumulation of forces and means. After Rzhev, we realized that one cannot fight by numbers, one must fight by skill. Marshal Vasilevsky later said, and indeed, the analysis of combat operations near Rzhev showed that frontal attacks on fortified enemy positions lead to unjustifiably high losses, even with a significant numerical superiority. The second important lesson was the understanding of the need to concentrate forces and means in the direction of the main attack. In operations near Rzhev, the offensive was often conducted along the entire front, which dispersed forces and did not allow achieving decisive superiority in any sector. After this experience, the Soviet command switched to the tactic of concentrating artillery, tanks, and aviation on narrow breakthrough sectors. Thus, if in Operation Mars, the artillery density averaged 80 to 100 barrels per kilometer of front, then in Operation Bagration, this figure reached 200 to 250 guns. This provided overwhelming firepower superiority and allowed literally breaking through the enemy's defenses. The third lesson concerned the interaction of different branches of the armed forces. Near Rzhev, situations often arose where tanks operated separately from infantry, artillery did not support advancing units, and aviation worked according to its own plan. This led to heavy losses and the disruption of the offensive. In subsequent operations, paramount attention was paid to issues of interaction. A clear system for coordinating the actions of infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation was developed. Tanks began to operate in close cooperation with motorized infantry, and special assault groups appeared to combat enemy strongholds. Aviation learned to effectively support ground forces, working on requests from division and regimental commanders. The fourth lesson was the improvement of the troop control system. The experience of the Rzhev Battle showed that without reliable communication and clear control, even a well-prepared operation can fail. Subsequently, the work of staffs at all levels significantly improved, and an effective system for transmitting orders and monitoring their execution was created. Commanders learned to flexibly react to changes in the situation, not clinging to the initial operational plan if it did not work. If near Rzhev, stubborn attacks in one direction continued even with the obvious impossibility of a breakthrough, then in subsequent operations, the command quickly shifted efforts to more promising sectors. The fifth important lesson was the understanding of the importance of engineering preparation for the offensive. Near Rzhev, Soviet troops often encountered unexpected obstacles: minefields, anti-tank ditches, wire entanglements. This slowed down the pace of the offensive and gave the enemy time to bring up reserves. Subsequently, before each major operation, thorough engineering reconnaissance was carried out. Special obstacle clearing groups were created, and column routes for equipment were laid. All this significantly increased the pace of the offensive and reduced losses. The sixth lesson concerned the work of the rear services. The Rzhev Battle showed that without reliable material support, even the most heroic efforts of the troops are doomed to failure. In subsequent operations, paramount attention was paid to issues of supply, evacuation of the wounded, and equipment repair. An effective system of field depots, repair bases, and medical posts was created. Advancing troops received the necessary amount of ammunition, fuel, and food. This allowed maintaining high rates of advance and developing initial success. Finally, the seventh lesson was psychological. The Rzhev Battle showed that the morale of the troops is a decisive factor in victory. Subsequently, great attention was paid not only to the material, but also to the moral support of combat operations. The system of awards was improved, the food and living conditions of soldiers were enhanced, and the work of political bodies was intensified. Modern historical science continues to reevaluate the events of the Rzhev Battle, uncovering new aspects of this tragic engagement. The opening of archives, the publication of previously classified documents, and the comparison of Soviet and German sources allow historians to create a more objective and multifaceted picture of what happened near Rzhev in 1942-1943. One of the most important areas of modern research is the clarification of the scale of Soviet troop losses. For many years, official figures were understated, and only in the 2000s were historians able to get closer to the truth. According to the latest data, the total losses of the Red Army in the Rzhev Battle amounted to between 1.1 million and 1.4 million people, a figure comparable to the losses in the Battle of Stalingrad. Archival research has provided a new perspective on the reasons for the failures of Soviet troops. While previously, these were explained predominantly by objective factors: strong German defenses, difficult terrain, weather conditions. Modern researchers also draw attention to subjective moments: miscalculations in planning operations, shortcomings in troop management, and the command's unpreparedness for large-scale offensive operations. Operation Mars, the last attempt by the Soviet command to eliminate the Rzhev salient in November-December 1942, is of particular interest. American historian David Glantz, in his monograph Zhukov's Greatest Defeat, put forward the theory that this operation was conceived as equivalent to Stalingrad, but, due to its failure, was subsequently forgotten. Russian historians dispute this view, pointing out that Mars was initially planned as an auxiliary strike designed to tie down enemy forces and prevent the transfer of German reserves to Stalingrad. An important area of research has been the study of the daily life of soldiers in the conditions of the Rzhev meat grinder. Based on letters, diaries, and memoirs of battle participants, historians reconstruct the soldiers' daily lives, their moods, motivations, and survival methods in extreme conditions. These materials allow us to see the war through the eyes of its direct participants, and to feel the human dimension of the tragedy. The question of the strategic significance of the Rzhev battle remains debatable. Some historians believe that the continuous attacks of Soviet troops, though not achieving their immediate goals, tied down significant enemy forces, preventing the German command from transferring reserves to other sectors of the front. Other researchers point to the disproportion between the results achieved and the losses incurred, considering the Rzhev battle an example of a strategic miscalculation by the Soviet command. New research also sheds light on the German side of the Rzhev battle. Analysis of Wehrmacht documents shows that the German command viewed the Rzhev salient as a key element of defense on the central sector of the front, and was prepared to hold it at all costs. Only a radical change in the strategic situation after the Stalingrad catastrophe forced the Germans to voluntarily abandon this area in March 1943. An important aspect of modern research is the analysis of the reflection of the Rzhev battle in collective memory and culture. Historians study how the perception of these events changed in different periods, from almost complete suppression during Soviet times to a gradual return to public consciousness in the post-Soviet period. Special attention is paid to the role of literature, cinema, and memorial practices in shaping historical memory of the Rzhev battle. For a long time, the Battle of Rzhev remained in the shadows of history, a forgotten tragedy that was not spoken of. But memory cannot be erased forever. In recent decades, these events have gradually returned to public consciousness, transforming the personal memories of participants into a national heritage. A turning point was the opening in 2020 of the Soviet Soldier Memorial Complex near Rzhev. The majestic 25-meter bronze figure of a warrior, as if dissolving into the sky with a flock of cranes, became a symbol of memory for the fallen. This image, inspired by Twardowski's poem, "I Was Killed Near Rzhev," embodied the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers whose names remained unknown. The memorial is not just a tribute to the fallen, says one of its creators, sculptor Andrei Korobtsov. It is an attempt to comprehend the tragedy, to translate it from the realm of statistics into the sphere of human destinies. Every fallen soldier is a life cut short, unfulfilled dreams, orphaned families. The search movement plays a special role in preserving memory. Annually, hundreds of volunteers come to the Rzhev district to find and rebury with honors the remains of fallen soldiers. Over the past 30 years, search parties have unearthed the remains of more than 35,000 soldiers, identifying the names of several thousand of them. The soil here is literally soaked in blood, says Sergei Petakov, head of one of the search detachments. Every spring, melted snow washes out new remains, helmets, medallions. Sometimes we find entire unburied units. This speaks to the scale of the tragedy and the chaos of those days. The cultural component has also become an important aspect of memory preservation. In recent years, dozens of books, documentaries, and feature films dedicated to the Battle of Rzhev have been released. Among them are Rzhev, The Unknown Battle of Georgy Zhukov by Alexei Pivovarov, I Was Killed Near Rzhev by Sergei Nuzdin, and the feature film Rzhev, directed by Igor Kopylov. The approach to teaching the history of the Great Patriotic War in schools is also gradually changing. If before the Battle of Rzhev was only mentioned in passing, now significant attention is paid to this topic. Thematic lessons, excursions to battle sites, and meetings with veterans and search parties are held in schools in the Tver region. Why is it so important to preserve the memory of tragic pages of history? This question is especially relevant today, when we observe attempts to rewrite the history of World War II, to belittle the role of the Soviet people in the victory over fascism. An honest understanding of the past is an immunity against repeating mistakes, believes historian Mikhail Myagkov. We must know not only about victories but also about tragedies. Only then can we truly understand the price our people paid for victory. It is also important that preserving the memory of the Battle of Rzhev is a restoration of historical justice towards its participants. For many years they remained forgotten heroes. Their feat was not properly appreciated and immortalized. Now this injustice is gradually being rectified. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over Russia and abroad visit the memorial complex near Rzhev annually. For many, it is not just an excursion, but a true pilgrimage, an opportunity to touch the history of their country, to honor the memory of their ancestors. The Battle of Rzhev is not only a tragic page in our history, but also a lesson for future generations. A lesson in courage, fortitude, and self-sacrifice, and at the same time, a warning about the terrible price paid for the mistakes of politicians and military leaders. Preserving the memory of the Battle of Rzhev is our duty to those who gave their lives on this land. It is a guarantee that their sacrifice was not in vain, that we have learned lessons from the past and will do everything possible to ensure that similar tragedies never happen again.